All right, I'm seeing we are at 1:02, so we'll jump right in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Our Campus, Our Safety Action Plan launch and press conference. We're really excited to be able to share in this space our action plan. I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Ziana Kotadia. I use she, her pronouns, and today I am located on Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation Region 3, as well as all people who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'm the former president of the Huron University College Students' Council and the former vice president University Affairs for the University Students' Council at Western University. Currently, I'm in my 5th year at Western University and Huron University College, and a core team member for the Safe Campus Coalition, the organizing team behind the September 2021 anti-gender-based and sexual violence walkout at Western University. Before we get started, I would love to provide some context on the origins of the action plan and explain the format of the press conference. Student leaders from more than 20 different universities, colleges, CEGEPS, and various national organizations, ultimately representing over 1.2 million students, gathered this summer to create 10 comprehensive calls to action for all levels of government, as well as for post-secondary institutions. We know that sexual violence is a serious issue in campuses, and this action plan provides some attainable goals in moving forward while centering student and survivor voices. Sexual violence should never be a part of the student experience. Student leaders from across the country today will provide their comments on the action plan and why it's important, and we will also discuss each individual ask. The action plan will be available for distribution in both English and French following the event. Folks will introduce themselves and their associations, provide their remarks, and then myself and my co-host Ariana will close the event. There will also be a couple minutes at the end for questions. If you're having trouble at any point with anything technical or accessibility related during the session, please let Aubriana Snow know by reaching out to her directly in the chat, and she would be happy to assist you. From coast to coast, students have been at the forefront of gender-based violence prevention and response efforts on Canadian post-secondary campuses. Our activism and advocacy have brought sexual violence on campus to the forefront of national conversations, and our voices remain vital to the project of dismantling the systems that produce gender-based violence. This action plan combines the ideas and recommendations of Canada's student leaders into a comprehensive 10-point plan for post-secondary institutions, the federal government, and provincial and territorial governments. Ultimately, students' unique insights into post-secondary cultures and our lived experiences navigating sexual violence policies and strategies put forward by post-secondary institutions position us to offer meaningful solutions. Until we effectively value students' voices in the project of eliminating gender-based violence on campus, this violence and inequity will continue to be a feature of the student experience at post-secondary institutions. So ultimately, this plan is our call to action, our articulation of what needs to be done differently to ensure campuses become safer and more equitable spaces. We need post-secondary institutions and governments to implement these calls to action now to address the epidemic of sexual violence on campus. I'd like to begin by discussing our first call to action for post-secondary institutions to create and implement sustainable, well-funded campus-wide education plans. Education must be a core tenet of any sexual and gender-based violence prevention strategy, but unfortunately, this work is often forgotten and deprioritized as post-secondary institutions seek to respond to the complex, evolving needs of the complaints process and survivor support. As a starting point, post-secondary institutions should consider instating a campus-wide curriculum, role-specific training, an education task force, and a comprehensive campus action plan informed by all campus stakeholders, especially students, but also including staff and faculty. Ensuring that campus communities are exposed to consistent prevention messages and education at multiple points over their tenure at post-secondary institutions, and that multiple programs, tools, pedagogical approaches, and techniques are leveraged is key to delivering effective educational programming. Thank you very much. I would now like to pass it on to my co-host, Ariana, to offer her commentary on the action plan.
Thanks so much for introducing the event and for those insightful thoughts, Zendaya. My name is Ariana Chartrand. I use she, her pronouns, and today I'm tuning in from the ancestral and traditional lands on Treaty 1 territory, which belongs to the Cree, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Cree, and Métis peoples, colonially referred to as Winnipeg, Manitoba. However, for the last several years, I've been occupying space as an uninvited guest on the unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, where I'm completing my bachelor's degree in early childhood education at Capilano University. I'm currently serving my second term as the Vice President External for the Capilano Students' Union, and my second term as Chairperson for the Alliance of BC Students, which represents students all across the lands and waters of the West Coast. For years, students have been calling on their respective provincial and federal governments, as well as the post-secondary institutions, for increased action to address sexualized violence in post-secondary environments. As a coalition of student unions and associations across the province of British Columbia, the Alliance of BC Students has brought this to the attention of decision makers through lobbying, budget submissions, consultations, and campaigns for years. And although we've seen some funding commitments and policy changes, far more work still needs to be done. Students have a right to a post-secondary education that works to create spaces and environments where students are supported and where students are safe. And often left out of these conversations that aim to do exactly that are students themselves. And so it's incredibly encouraging to see students across the country working together to create an action plan. Our second call to action is for the application of trauma-informed practices, procedural fairness, and harm reduction principles to all sexual violence complaint processes. Institutions typically protect the most powerful, and post-secondary institutions are not immune to this. So making a complaint can be difficult. It can be tiring. It can be re-traumatizing for survivors, especially when the complaint process does not meet the foundational standards of procedural fairness, trauma-informed practice, and harm reduction. Where a PSI does use a trauma-informed practice as part of their survivor-driven approach, there often tends to be this belief that the procedural fairness and trauma-informed practice exist in opposition or tension with one another. In reality, when this is applied to both parties and complemented with harm reduction measures, procedural fairness and trauma-informed practice work together to create a stronger, more humane process for all. Additionally, we're calling on post-secondary institutions with the need to offer an alternative, non-adjudicative means to justice and accountability, to truly honor the principles of trauma-informed practice and harm reduction. Bureaucratic processes with punitive outcomes are not the only legitimate response to sexual violence. They should not be considered universally appropriate or safe, given the harms inherent in institutional processes and their role as reproductive power structures. A trauma-informed response means allowing the survivor to decide whether to engage in an institutional complaints process and providing non-adjudicative processes as equally valid options to support the survivor's autonomy. I'll next be passing it on to my colleague and peer, Kayla.
Thank you, Ariana, for speaking to the needs of changes to be made to the complaint process. In supporting survivors, we need to ensure post-secondary institutions are honoring the principles of trauma-informed practice and harm reduction. My name is Kayla Hahn, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently a steering committee member at the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance and the Vice President of Government and Stakeholder Relations at Wilfrid Laurier University Students' Union in Waterloo, Ontario, located on the Haldimand Tract, home of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Today, I'll briefly be speaking to our third recommendation, calling for accessible academic accommodations for survivors. Academic accommodations are an immediate and flexible approach to support students' well-being after an incident of sexual and/or gender-based violence. Providing survivors with academic accommodations gives survivors the opportunity to focus on their health and well-being without the fear of their education being affected. Presently, there are many deterrents to survivors accessing accommodations under accessibility legislation and university policy, including lengthy bureaucratic processes and mandatory medical documentation. There is a lack of clarity or gray area in terms of transparency and anonymity. Students should be given clear information outlining the administrative process they are trying to access and shouldn't have to repeatedly disclose their assault to various university offices just to receive that accommodation. Survivors should know who will have access to their information and why, any limits on the number of times a certain accommodation request can be made, and alternatives if the request is denied. Students deserve to have a seamless and unintrusive academic accommodation process. At Laurier, we are currently learning to walk our talk by examining how our current reporting process can be further improved by providing transparent messages to the survivor on the status of their report within the Students' Union. Therefore, we are asking all post-secondary institutions in the province to work with students' unions to develop or modify an official academic accommodation policy that is survivor-centric and outlines the process for seeking academic accommodations for sexualized violence. By providing a clear direction of how the students' union will be of support, there will be a lack of miscommunication and disarray to provide the students with the most suitable accommodation available to still help them succeed in their academic endeavors. Thank you.
Thanks, Kayla, for those insightful thoughts. You did an excellent job articulating our thoughts on accessible academic accommodations for survivors. So my name is Olufunke Sophia Adeleye. I use she and her pronouns. I am a fourth-year nursing student at Brandon University, and I'm also the president of the Brandon University Students Union. I'm joining from Brandon University, and that is situated in Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territories. And these traditional territories are the shared lands of the Dakota, Ojibwe, Cree, Dene, and the Red River Métis nations. Over the years, many students across Canada have shared their concerns and experiences about accounts of sexualized violence on and off campus. Unfortunately, despite some efforts from institutions across Canada, the cases of sexual violence against different groups of people within the country increases. According to the Ending Violence Association of BC, a subset of the Western Canada Sexual Assault Initiative, funded by the Status of Women Canada, as many as 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted while obtaining a post-secondary education. Students are most at risk during the first year of their studies, with many sexual assaults perpetrated within the first 8 weeks of the academic year. With a return to back in-person class in the fall, there is a possibility of an increase in sexual violence cases beyond that noted by the association. This may be as a result of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, where many individuals, including new and returning students, have not had the opportunity to interact with large groups of diverse people, such as one which would be seen within university classrooms for extended periods of time. These numbers and the potential increase has and is quite frightening, as we know the detrimental effects of sexual violence on an individual's dignity, esteem, mental, physical, psychological, and emotional health. Loss of life is also a real possibility. I will now be speaking on centering the survivors' voices in institutional policy making in meaningful ways. That is our PSI call Action 4. Consequently, students from across the country have met over the past months to create action plans to combat these concerning issues. One of the calls to action is to center survivor voices in institutional policy making in meaningful ways. This cannot be overemphasized. In order to know how best to help a person, the most reasonable thing to do will be to ask them. Centering survivor voices in institutional policy making is a key factor in addressing the issue of sexual violence. Survivors know by experience, unfortunately, where the gaps are within university systems that consequently lead or promote sexual violence on campus. They also know what structures and policies should be in place and considered meticulously in order to end sexual violence cases on campus. And lastly, they can provide best practices on how to compassionately assist survivors when they come forward to make reports to members within the post-secondary community. This last piece is very important, as there have been multiple cases of university, colleges, post-secondary education, staff, or faculty perpetrating sexual violence, burying sexual violence reports, dismissing sexual violence reports, taking no action, or delaying unreasonably the reports of sexual violence on campus. Sometimes certain policies encourage this behavior by using certain processes to silence the survivor. Not setting out consequences for individuals in authority who receive reports and delay or do not take action to assist the survivor also encourage this behavior. At other times, policies may be adequate but lack awareness and are not easily accessible to students on campus. Some of these are accessible resources that can be seen on policies which are adequate. Students are not aware of it, and as such, sexual violence occurs. And this is a concerning issue. With survivors at the center of policy making within post-secondary institutions, these and many concerns can be adequately discussed and addressed within policies. Thank you very much, and I will pass it on to Marie.
Thank you so much, Olufunke. That was so important. Hello, bonjour, je m'appelle Marie, mes pronoms sont elle et je suis la présidente nationale de la Fédération canadienne des étudiants et des étudiantes. My name is Marie, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students. I'm calling in from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. La Fédération est fière de soutenir les appels à l'action lancés dans le plan d'action Notre campus, notre sécurité. Pendant des décennies, les étudiants ont exigé les gestionnaires et les gouvernements prenant au sérieux la nécessité de s'attaquer à la violence genrée sur les campus et d'élaborer des politiques axées sur des expériences de survivantes. Grâce au leadership et des étudiants et des activistes, les gestionnaires des établissements d'enseignement supérieur et les gouvernements provinciaux et fédéraux ont maintenant des objectifs clairs lorsqu'ils se joignent aux étudiants pour lutter contre la violence sur les campus. Often using their own resources to provide support for survivors, educate and mobilize people around gender-based violence, and lobby administrations and governments, students have taken on this work with little to no support from other parties and continue to do so across the country. Students have been leaders in combating sexualized violence on campus and supporting survivors, and it is time for institutions, administrations, and governments to join us in this work. I'd like to briefly focus on calls to action 5 and 6 for provincial and territorial governments. Call to action number 5 speaks to the currently incomplete and inconsistent data collection at provincial and territorial levels, which can make it very difficult to accurately understand sexual violence at post-secondary institutions across the country. Provincial and territorial governments can support consistent data collection by requiring post-secondary institutions to participate in recurring and trauma-informed campus sexual violence climate surveys. Collaborating with student leaders and survivors, these survey results should be released promptly and inform university policies and responses to realities of sexualized violence on campus. At this time, there's no legislative or regulatory framework that governs sexualized violence prevention education at post-secondary institutions. While some provinces have sexual violence legislation, there are large discrepancies across the country. A lack of strong legislative and regulatory frameworks coupled with serious underfunding has resulted in students and students' unions disproportionately carrying the burden of prevention education. Call to action number 6 to create and strengthen provincial and territorial legislative and regulatory frameworks that address and prevent sexualized violence on campus make it clear that prevention education should, at a minimum, be a shared responsibility between students and their administrations. Provincial and territorial governments are responsible for laying the foundation of meaningful preventative education. It is necessary for provincial and territorial governments to introduce legislation on responding to sexualized violence at post-secondary education and to work with students and survivors to ensure that legislation is inclusive, accessible, and reflective of the unique needs of students in their respective provinces or territories. I'll conclude by saying that the 10 calls to action in the Our Campus, Our Safety Action Plan are clear, direct, and provide attainable goals to administrators and governments on how to support survivors and concretely address gender-based violence on university and college campuses. Thanks to the leadership of Possibility Seeds and student advocates, post-secondary administrators and governments now have clear objectives as they join students in addressing gender-based violence on campus. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Mary. What you just said was truly inspiring. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je m'appelle Sandrine Tremblay. J'utilise les pronoms elle, she, her et je suis présidente de l'Union étudiante du Québec, Québec Student Union, une association étudiante qui représente 91 000 personnes étudiantes universitaires à travers le Québec. Je suis présentement à Montréal, Chouatake, un territoire autochtone qui n'a jamais été cédé. Je suis très fière aujourd'hui d'être devant vous pour vous présenter ce plan d'action accompagné de leaders étudiantes à travers le Canada. Ça fait plusieurs années que les associations étudiantes se mobilisent et font des actions pour prévenir et combattre les violences à caractère sexuel. Depuis plusieurs années, on assiste à un réel changement de culture. Il y a quelques années à peine, plus précisément en 2016, il y avait une crise dans le milieu universitaire québécois en lien avec les violences sexuelles. On entendait toutes sortes d'histoires de personnes qui se sentaient obligées de participer à des activités à caractère sexuel sans pouvoir dire non. À ce moment-là, moi, j'étais étudiante à l'Université Laval à Québec. En octobre 2016, il y a un étudiant qui s'est fait dire que les étudiantes dans les résidences universitaires sont des filles faciles, puis que c'est simple d'avoir des relations sexuelles avec elles. Il suffit juste de rentrer dans leur chambre. L'homme en question, il a été jugé coupable de 4 entrées par infraction avec agression sexuelle et de 4 autres entrées par infraction avec la tentative de commettre une agression sexuelle. Je vous dirais que moi, en tant qu'étudiante à ce moment-là, ça m'a énormément secouée, puis je doutais réellement de la sécurité de mon campus. Les associations étudiantes québécoises ont rapidement revendiqué des actions, puis elles se sont mobilisées pour faire des changements. Quelques temps après ces événements-là, au Québec, on parlait d'instaurer une loi cadre, ce qui allait devenir bientôt la loi visant à prévenir et à combattre les violences à caractère sexuel en milieu d'enseignement supérieur. La loi au Québec n'est pas parfaite. Elle autorise les relations sexuelles entre les profs et les personnes étudiantes, malgré les conflits d'intérêts que ça suscite. La loi ne prohibe pas les violences à caractère sexuel dans les clauses d'amnistie, dans les conventions collectives du personnel. Mais au moins, on a une loi. C'est pas toutes les provinces qui ont cette chance-là. Grâce à cette loi, il y a des formations obligatoires pour le personnel et pour les personnes étudiantes. La loi, elle oblige aussi les établissements d'enseignement supérieur à avoir des comités consultatifs sur les violences sexuelles. La loi prévoit une représentation étudiante au sein des comités. Puis cette présence étudiante-là dans les comités, elle est essentielle pour bien refléter la réalité étudiante, puis mettre l'avant les préoccupations de la communauté étudiante. Or, ce genre de comité-là, il n'existe pas dans tous les établissements d'enseignement supérieur canadiens. Pourtant, c'est essentiel que la communauté étudiante soit consultée et c'est pourquoi on formule la 7e demande aujourd'hui, soit de créer des comités consultatifs dans les provinces, dans les territoires, sur les violences sexuelles dans les campus avec une représentation étudiante rémunérée. Comme les personnes étudiantes sont directement touchées par la violence sexuelle sur les campus, elles devraient être au cœur de la prise de décision et avoir la possibilité de contribuer directement à la conception, à la mise en œuvre et à l'évaluation de ces politiques. A few words in English. So our 7th ask is to build Provincial, Territorial advisory committees on campus sexual violence with paid student representation. As students are directly impacted by campus sexual violence, they ought to be at the core of decision making and have the opportunity to directly provide input on the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of these policies. Peu à peu, il y a une culture de consentement qui remplace la culture du viol. C'est essentiel aujourd'hui de mettre au centre de nos pratiques les personnes victimes, les personnes survivantes. Malheureusement, encore aujourd'hui, on entend encore des histoires d'étudiants qui sont dans la même classe que leur agresseur et que l'institution ne peut rien faire. Le combat, il n'est pas gagné. C'est pour ça qu'on a besoin d'actions concrètes de la part des gouvernements provinciaux, fédéraux et des établissements d'enseignement supérieur pour instaurer un milieu de vie sain et sécuritaire pour la population étudiante. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Je vais maintenant laisser la parole à Isabelle.
Hi, thank you so much to Sammy Jane. All of that was incredible and definitely inspiring. I want to echo what she said at the end there, that students are definitely at the heart of this. And that's why I think both this action group and the actions that came out of it are so important. And overall, student input is what's going to fix the issue more so than anything else. So hi everyone, my name is Isabel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of Campaigns at the MUN Student Union on the unceded traditional homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, colonially known as St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. So the provincial call to action that I am speaking on today is call number 8, which is ensuring sustainable funding for community sexual assault centers and post-secondary institution sexual assault services. Public funding is something that is actually quite close to my heart. Working within the student movement in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a history of publicly funded education, and it's something that is discussed a lot within our student union. The discussion of how having publicly funded education in post-secondary creates greater financial freedom. It brings greater safety to marginalized groups, whether that be queer folks, trans folks, racialized students, in all different ways. And it's proven to be a diffuser of violence. So funding post-secondary education has a direct link to guaranteeing one's basic material conditions and diffusing the kind of violence we're discussing here today. There's also the discussion of prioritizing where this money goes. So by ensuring sustainable funding for community sexual assault centers and post-secondary institution sexual assault services, marginalized students always need to be prioritized. Putting the money into sexual assault services to make them trauma-informed, harm-reductive, and responsive to the needs of queer, trans, and racialized students, as my colleagues here have said today, it's an immediate necessity. It's not something to be debated or worked towards. Politicians are speaking out in support of survivors constantly, but this means nothing without the material conditions to back it up. Politicians quite literally have the control over where and how public funding is allocated. By slashing the budgets of education and other social services, they have made it quite clear where their priorities lie. And at this point in time, it's not with students, it's not with survivors, it's not with these groups. I think coming from a Newfoundland and Labrador perspective, we have seen a massive cut to public education in the past year. Our tuition at the one university within the entire province is more than doubling this semester, this fall semester, which is something that we haven't seen in more than 22 years, an increase in tuition. And it goes much further than that. Our sexual harassment office is dutifully underfunded, and this is a problem that isn't just an issue within Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's of course across the country. So prioritizing that sustainable funding, it's essential, it's life-saving, it's necessary. And I think all of the different calls to action are exactly what I would like to see come out of our governments. It's not something I would like to see, actually. It's something that needs to happen immediately, and they urgently need to be called on. I think I would just like to echo what I said before, but having these politicians come out and speak in support of survivors when they quite literally hold all of the money in their hands is ridiculous. It's actually quite disgusting because they have the power to change that. Administrators at our post-secondary institutions, they quite legitimately have the power to change, to have the trauma-informed policies. So if anybody takes anything from these calls of action, I would say that it is that the power needs to be put back, the pushback. It's not my job or any other student union's job to put together a plan to action on how the government needs to be providing for their students, and yeah, we still have. And yeah, that's pretty well everything I have to say. Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Sienna.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I agree with you completely. This is vital. This is urgent. This is necessary. We're getting close to concluding the speaker portion of the press conference, but before we do, I'd like to call attention to our 9th recommendation, this being a call to action for the federal government to set a national standard on addressing, preventing, and responding to sexual violence on campus. Isabel highlighted this beautifully in talking about how our decision makers do have the access to create meaningful change because the federal government has tremendous capacity to generate broad cultural change and support post-secondary institutions in their commitment to providing a healthy, safe, and empowering educational environment. So in order to produce this national standard that is evidence-based, accountable, trauma-informed, accessible, and intersectional, it needs to be created and led by a national advisory committee that includes representation from survivors, from student researchers, academics, administrators, frontline workers, and community organizations. This national standard must be considerate of all different parts of a student's educational environment, not just classroom experiences, but also experiential learning opportunities where students are uniquely vulnerable. So that concludes our list of speakers for today's press conference. We want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to center the voices of students and survivors. We know that journalists play a really important role in the work to end sexual violence on Canadian campuses, and we're really honored to have been able to share this space with you today. The action plan will be accessible via Google Drive, and the link will be sent out to all the emails that received invites to the press conference following this event. And I will pass it back to my co-host Ariana to wrap things up.
Thank you very much, Ziana, and to all of our wonderful speakers today. It's so exciting to see the work of student leaders move forward in a good way. And we know this momentum will only continue to grow. We do have time for only a couple questions. So journalists, I'll ask you to use the hand raise function on Zoom, and I can call on you. I think I'll give another opportunity. If anyone had any questions, just use your Zoom function to raise the hand and I can connect you with a speaker. Janet, I'm not sure if that is for the hand raise function. If you do have a question, I can absolutely
That is me.
Okay, fantastic.
Hello. Hi, I'll put my audio on there. Hi, everybody. I'm Janet Hilley from the Toronto Star. And I was just wondering, what do you hope, other than having this presser, whose hands are you putting this document and this information into? And then how do you propose to make sure that and measure the demands that you're asking for are carried out? How do you apply pressure beyond releasing a 10-point plan? What's your hopes?
Go ahead, Ziana.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Janet. I think, first of all, we're handing this to the decision makers. We are giving this 10-point plan from student leaders to our provincial and territorial governments, to our post-secondary institutions, to our federal governments, not just because we believe in the importance of doing this work, but, you know, as we've said throughout the conference, because this work is vital, because it's urgent, because it's life-saving. And in terms of how we intend to track the implementation of these recommendations, I imagine most student government organizations, as well as Possibility Seeds, will be paying close attention to how post-secondary institutions respond, how our governments respond, and holding these institutions and these governments accountable is part of the work that we do every day in our lobbying, in our interviews with folks like you, and in our conversations and community engagement with students. So all of us will be keeping our eye on the ball to make sure that these recommendations are implemented and to follow up with strong advocacy.
Thank you very much, Janet and Ziana. I believe we have time for one more question. Again, if you do have a question, please use the Zoom function and raise your hand. All right, if there are no further questions, I believe we can wrap it up here. I did see someone unmute though, so I do want to give space if someone does have a question.
Allô? Allô?
Oui, bonjour.
Oui, bonjour. Mon nom c'est Freddy, je suis de Radio-Canada. Peut-être que la question s'adresse évidemment à une francophone. C'est pour savoir quels sont, disons, qu'est-ce que vous attendez concrètement des différentes autorités, que ce soit académique ou au niveau gouvernemental, pour la mise en exécution de votre plan?
Oui, parfait. Donc, pour cette question-là, je vais passer la parole à Sami Jane, présidente de l'Union étudiante du Québec.
Oui, alors, il y a énormément de choses auxquelles on s'attend. Évidemment, là, il y a beaucoup d'actions qui peuvent être prises par les gouvernements. Au Québec, là, comme je disais dans mon allocution, on a la chance d'avoir une loi. C'est pas la même chose dans les autres provinces, donc on demande d'avoir de l'encadrement législatif, là, par exemple, dans les différentes provinces et territoires. Donc, il y a des actions gouvernementales qui peuvent être prises, mais également des actions directement là, par les universités, par les CEGEPS, les collèges aussi. Là. Je ne sais pas là, si ça répondait à votre question.
Oui, merci.
Merci beaucoup. We have another questions from CBC if we have time. Yeah, okay, Jasmine, you can go.
Thanks for taking my question. I'm just wondering, I mean, from what I understand, the greatest risk for unwanted sexual behavior is in the first 8 weeks, according to the report. Why would you say that would be? What's contributing to that vulnerable time?
Does someone would like to answer this question? Raising hands. Yes, Isabel, you can go.
Yeah, so I would say that the reason why we say the first 8 weeks are the most vulnerable time for students is because of the big transition period, and also because folks are moving into residence and because of the culture that kind of comes out of welcome weeks and different orientation activities. So folks on campus, there is like a lot of drinking that occurs within those first couple of weeks, and that opens up the opportunity for situations that haven't been protected thus far by our institutions and governments. And I think obviously this is not a result of any one culture or anybody deciding to take part in the orientation events. I think it's more so a cocktail opportunity where our institutions aren't properly educating or putting in place programs to be there and have that trauma-informed, harm-reductive centered care within the first couple of weeks of campus. I also want to turn it over to Aubriana to add to that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Isabel. I just want to add how deeply essential consent is to post-secondary and other levels of education as well. Consent is an essential life skill and is really key in those 8 weeks, the red zone, where sexual violence is at a high throughout the academic year and throughout the year as well. It's really important to ensure that folks have the autonomy to make those decisions and to be educated on their own rights and their own bodily freedom. And I see Kayla had something to add as well, so I'll pass it to you, Kayla.
Thanks, Aubriana. You basically touched on what I was going to say, but I was also going to mention, because the incoming first-year students are students who only had maybe 1 full year, grade 9 in person, having those in-person conversations about sexual health. There is a possibility that a lot of these conversations did not emerge in the remote environment when other teachers had prioritized their own teachings. So this is probably something that they have also not had the conversation about with consensual health. And that's kind of where we see a lot of that gap, especially with incoming first-year students compared to maybe senior students who had this conversation in high school before. Thank you. And I'll pass it off to Mehdi.
Thanks so much, Kayla. Jasmine, I'll just add, it's not specifically to your question, but I think like maybe offer some context about why we're here today. School starts in a couple of days, like the red zone starts in 5 days, you know, and this is really real for people, and we've made that clear. So this action plan is being released now also as an opportunity. We are often in positions of reactivity to these realities of sexualized violence on campus, and this is an opportunity to know what's coming. The red zone is right around the corner. And here are some concrete things that people can do, both while we have the 8 weeks ahead of us and moving forward, so that these realities aren't as pervasive as they are right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maria, and I'll pass it on to you, Aubriana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ariana. I just wanted to add, a lot of institutions think that doing a one-time workshop with 100+ students is an acceptable way to address sexualized violence on campus. It is not. Folks need different opportunities based on their own lived experiences to engage with this material in a good way, and it needs to be done at smaller levels so that folks are really absorbing the material. We have the opportunity to start the year off right and really change the way that post-secondary institutions and governments are addressing sexualized violence on campus. And I think that these calls to action really outline a great way to do that. So I'm really grateful to have been here today. Thanks. I'll pass it back to Ariana.
Thank you very much, Aubriana. All right, I believe that wraps up our time today. I do not see any more hands for further questions.
If I could just ask one more question. You want mandatory workshops that you had just mentioned. You know, what would that look like? What do you say that, what the university institutions are like, saying, how can we possibly ramp that up in a week or two, that this takes a lot of time to get together, that they won't be able to provide anything like this for this year? I mean, what do you think, if anything, can be done along the workshop line within the start, to follow up on your first recommendation about those mandatory workshops?
I'd like to pass this on to Ziana. Go ahead.
Feel free to jump in, Aubriana. But one thing that comes to mind, and I did mention this early on in my remarks, is that in order for this education to be comprehensively developed, it does require a mix of different strategies and a mix of different methodologies. And so, that might mean workshops that are held on a smaller scale in more intimate in-person settings, but there are other things that universities can be doing at the same time. Western University, for example, last year, in the aftermath of the return to campus that the university experienced, did actually end up producing mandatory education for students living in residence pretty quickly after September. And by the time the school year came to an end, they had actually developed a full program related to developing these sessions for students. So it is possible to make that kind of change in a year and to establish training, workshops, and to make them mandatory for students.
Would anyone else like to add to Ziana's thoughts? Or Jasmine, did you have any follow-up comments?
Just a quick thought here, maybe. Yes. I will talk just for a second about Quebec's reality. In universities and CEGEPS in Quebec, we included mandatory training since 2018, and every year students are obligated to go through that training, and it's an online training. So about what Ziana said, it's also about joining different ways of doing those workshops, this training, this learning. So if you want to know more about how it's coming along in Quebec, you can also write to me so I can connect you with Sami Jane that can tell you more about it.
Just one
I
last.
see your hand is raised. Go ahead, Aubriana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ariana. I will just add one more quick piece. I think it's really important to note that this is an ongoing journey. This isn't something that is going to be fixed in the next 2 weeks. Institutions and folks in power need to be focused on this discussion throughout the year. Consent workshops need to be ongoing, and students, faculty, and staff need to be exposed to consistent prevention and education messaging throughout the year and in an ongoing fashion. So I think that's really important. It's just so essential to keep this conversation going. It's really timely at the beginning of the year, but there's so much more to it than that. And there's also a lot of opportunities for institutions to forge meaningful relationships with student organizations and also with folks in the community to address these issues. So that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Is there any more comments or questions from anyone attending today? All right, so I'm not seeing any. So I think now we can wrap it up.